Okay, so we'll begin with a very brief lecture, and then we'll dive into the exercises. This is designed to be a fun course. Obviously, machine learning is changing quite rapidly at the moment, and this stuff, though it seems somewhat like it could have been presented or written 5-6 years ago, I still think the content of this course is still relevant. We're covering some of the fundamentals and the foundations, and though you could probably go through these exercises with your favorite LLM and go through it in like 5 minutes, I'd encourage you not to do that and just try to struggle as much as you can. That's where you get the most learning out of this course. So yeah, I'll hand over to Isaac, and we'll just give a quick introduction to PyTorch.
All right, so I'm going to be giving a quick introduction to neural networks and a bit of the theory behind it and how to implement them in PyTorch. So the rough schedules, we have a lecture from 9:30 to 10:30 today, and then another one in the afternoon, and the final one in tomorrow morning. And today we'll be going over some feed-forward neural networks, and tomorrow we'll be hopefully get onto some convolutional neural networks. So the key objectives that we hope to impart with you by the time you leave is to be able to understand how you can structure developing a machine learning model if it's useful for any work that you're doing. And I guess the key things to note is that we want to make sure that you understand how important it is to understand the data that you're working with. You're working in different climate applications, so I'm sure you'll have the relevant knowledge, but it's important to, when you're developing machine learning models, to understand how the data and the variables are related to each other, and use that to inform the way you choose your features and the way you design your ML model. We'll give you introductory overview of PyTorch, how to use it, the different functionalities that it provides, and building a basic pipeline and training loop. I hope to encourage you to keep building the good research software engineering habits that you've looked at since fun. We'll be going over some classification exercises during these tutorials, and there's also some regression ones that you can go over yourself. So we have neural networks, and before we go into neural networks, we're going to be looking at one of the most fundamental algorithms to training or getting the neural network to learn. Because if you want to understand neural networks, you need to understand how they learn. And if you want to understand how they learn, you need to know what stochastic gradient descent is and how it works. And to understand stochastic gradient descent, you need to have an understanding of what the gradient is. So we're going to be looking at a simple case of a straight line. Very exciting. So we have a straight line, you'll have seen it in high school or secondary school, and we can differentiate this straight line. And when you differentiate it, if you learn in high school or secondary school or A-levels, then you'll know that when you differentiate a line, you get the slope of the line. But there's another way that we can look at the derivative of a function. And you can think of a derivative as a function as something that gives you a vector which points in the direction of steepest descent. So you could think of yourself like on a mountain, and you look around, and then you think of in what you might think, in what direction should I step to maximize my height on the mountain? So if we differentiate it, considering y equals x, then you get dy dx equals 1. And if we want to not just think about how to increase go up the mountain, you want to think about how you want to go down the mountain, you will take the negative of that gradient. So that would give you the direction of the vector in steepest descent, so going down. And all this is essentially saying that the gradient is saying, how can I move? What direction or vector can I move in to either maximize the value or minimize the value? And so if we think about a model, essentially with a model, you have some data and you're trying to fit a function to that data. And that's essentially what modeling is. And you might think we have a model and we want to evaluate how good or bad it is. So we need a way to measure how well our predictions match the true value for the observations. So we need a way to measure that. So you can see an example of a straight line. Maybe the x-axis is like years of experience and the y-axis is pay. So maybe when you start out, you're negative, you're earning negative because maybe you're developing your skills, and then as you increase, you earn more per hour. And maybe the guy at maybe this guy should just buy something up. Go out before you. So we have a straight line, and this straight line is making predictions. And say we have a prediction over here, the last one. We can say that this line predicts maybe about 26, and the true value is about 35. So we can take the difference between this prediction and this value, and then we get some number. And if we do that for all of these points, and then we sum up the total, then you'll get like a measure of how good the model is. And the bigger the model, the bigger the number, the worse, you can say the worse the model performs. And the smaller the number, the better the model is, because it's the difference between the prediction and the true value is small. So we might consider using the mean squared error to quantify the loss, because if you were just to take some of the differences, you get some negative values. So you would need to do the mod to make it positive, and that's harder to differentiate. So we have the mean squared error, which means that we have a positive value where for any time the predictions are bad, the number is big, and when the predictions are good, the number is small, and then this is differentiable. So we have we're able to get the gradient. So now we have a model, we have some data, and we have the average loss or the cost, and we can expand this mean squared error out, and then we get a differential. And this differential is a differential with the loss with respect to m. So this is saying with a small change in x, how does this affect the loss? And remember, the loss is a measure of how good the model is. So ideally, we want to think about how we can change the parameters to make the loss as small as possible. And thereby minimizing the loss is minimizing the overall error of of the model, and that makes sure you have better predictions and a better model. So we learned that the negative gradient gives you the vector, the direction of the vector in for steepest descent. So what we can do is just take the original parameters that you have. Maybe the parameters are initialized randomly at first, and then we evaluate the predictions with the true values, and then we were able to calculate the differential of the loss, and then through this update rule, we're able to step the vectors in able to step the parameters in the direction that minimizes the loss. And we have a learning right here to specify how big the step that you want to take. And this is important because in more complex functions, the gradient is different at different places. So you want to make small steps and then calculate the gradient again, and take small steps and calculate the gradient again. Like if you're going down a mountain, you want to take one big step, you will probably die. You'll take small steps and then evaluate again which step to take. So brief recap: we have some data, we have a model. We want to model something important to your research area. A loss function which measures how good or bad the model is, and then an optimization procedure like stochastic gradient descent, or more commonly you will use something called mini batch, which is just so stochastic gradient descent is doing gradient descent with one example, and mini batch is doing with multiple examples, and batch is using the whole data. So what about neural networks? Well, neural networks are just functions, and the same way we could optimize the parameters of a line, we can optimize the parameters of a neural network. And a neural network is similar to a straight line, but it has many more parameters, and it has an activation function, which we'll talk about shortly, which has some nonlinearity. So with a straight line, you could only model linear things. With a neural network, you can model nonlinearities. So the simplest neural networks that you come across is often called fully connected neural networks, or multi-layer perceptions, or some other names. And essentially what a neural network does is mapping features through subsequent layers using matrix multiplication. So you can have an input, and essentially you multiply it by some matrix, and then you apply an activation function, and then you multiply by a matrix and apply an activation function, and you continue doing it in that way. And the activation function is very important because the activation function introduces some nonlinearity into the network. If you didn't have an activation function, you would just have a bunch of matrix multiplications, and if you just have a bunch of matrix multiplications, you'll just get some linear model. And deep learning is when you have a large number of layers. So the number of layers is very big, so you call that deep learning. And if you don't include an activation function in your neural network, you have a pretty useless model. So no matter how big you were to make the model, without an activation function, it'll just be pretty useless. So if you want a useless model, then don't use, well, it'll be useful for a few things, but if you want a useless model, then don't use activation function. So neural networks can be used for classification and regression. Classification is predicting some label. So for example, classification is predicting the label, and regression is normally predicting some continuous value, like we saw earlier with the XY graph. fully connected neural networks normally deal with tabular data. So something that you might have in Excel or a pandas data frame, and you can, if you want the neural net to learn from these values, then you'll need to put them in vectors so that the computer can understand. Yes, so like I said, you can do classification for labels, like is this a dog or a cat, or for regression. So maybe predicting the size of the apple based on some nutrients in the soil, something. So in this tutorial, we'll be going over PyTorch and different classification problems, and there'll be regression problems that you can go over in your own time. PyTorch is a deep learning framework that's can be used in Python and C++, but pretty much everybody just uses it in Python. And there are other frameworks like JAX, TensorFlow, and PyTorch Lightning. PyTorch Lightning is kind of like a wrapper around PyTorch. So used in production stuff, and yeah, maybe if you want to do a startup and make the big bucks, maybe you'll learn PyTorch Lightning. So now we're going to be going over some key concepts in PyTorch. That's the data sets, the data loaders, and the module. And data sets should be pretty self-explanatory from the name. I'll look at how you implement it. So we have classes in Python. So the dataset class provides some uniform way for you to interact with your data, and it handles loading raw files, whether that's images on disk or CSV files or audio or time series data, and it allows you to split your data set into train, validation, and test. So typically you want to train on your data set, and then test it on another data set that it hasn't seen to measure the accuracy, to make sure it's learning patterns and not just memorizing the data set. And you have transforms or augmentation, which is transforming the data that you have from one way to another. For example, you might decide that you want to transform an RGB image to a black and white image or grayscale image. And item retrieval, so getting a single item from a data set. So if we look at the anatomy of a custom data set, first we can look at the constructor, the init method. Init was also slang in the UK for American folks. So the first thing that you want to do is download the files, download the data. So that could be files, if you were looking at images or and labels. So you have a corresponding data or record or row, and then a label. And this load index file is basically loading the data from some directory, and then you can pass it in a split. So that's saying whether you want the training part of the data set or the test part of the data set. And then this just in this example, we're using images. So this will give you a path to the image, and then whether it's a cat or a dog. And then you have some transforms to transform the data from one thing to another. And there's two other things that you need to implement if you're subclassing the dataset class, and that is the length of the dataset. So PyTorch knows how big the dataset is. So you just do the length of the number of paths, so the length of all the paths, all the individual images. And then you need some logic for getting a single item from the data set. So in here we're opening the image using pillow, we're converting it to RGB, and then we can apply some transforms to the data, and then we can get the label, and then we can pass out a single example. And now with these two methods, PyTorch knows how big the data set is and how to fetch one record. So that's the gist of using a custom data set. And in this case, you can pass the data, the directory path, where you've got train and split, and you can pass in the transform that you want to apply to the data. And then now you can see the underscore len method in action, that it knows how big the data set is. And now you have the get item underscore method in action, where you can get out a single example. So now we can look at the data loader, now that we understand what the data set is, and the data loader wraps around the data. And the data loader handles a lot of logic for us so that we don't need to write it ourselves. And one of them is batching. I mentioned mini batch gradient descent. So it essentially just takes in a number of items that you can specify to calculate, so that you can use it to calculate gradient on and to update the parameters of your network. So it takes the average gradient of all the samples in the batch, and you can shuffle. It allows you to shuffle the data, which means that since we're not using the entire data set for in one batch, and that's usually because the GPU doesn't have enough memory to compute the gradient of an entire data set, we can shuffle the data so that when we're calculating the gradient, we have an unbiased estimate of what the true gradient is. And then once you do gradient descent over many batches, there'll be a true estimate of the real gradient, because just taking a batch will give you, just the estimate of the gradient. The data set allows you to do multi-processing, so you can fetch data, multiple pieces of data at once, and it returns the batch of the data and the labels ready for training for the GPU. So this would be a typical data loader code. So it'll take in a data set, then you can specify the batch size, so 64 images, and when you want to shuffle it to have an unbiased estimator, and then the number of workers, so the number of threads or cores that would be used to collect the data. And then you can just use the for loop on the data bit. And now we'll look at this module was sequential, but first we'll look at what this torch.nn.linear means. And this is essentially just in the previous example, you saw the neural network with this is essentially the torch.nn.linear layer is essentially mapping all these weights from one layer to another, and that's essentially what that torch.nn.linear is doing. And then you have the activation function, which introduces the non-linearities into the network, and you're applying a bunch of linear layers, activation functions, linear layers, activation functions, and the torch.nn.sequential just tells PyTorch that I want to apply all of these linear layers and activation functions in the order that I specified it in the code. And this is a very simple way that you can implement a multi-layer perception. So now we'll look at the module class, and this is the base class for all neural networks. And there's two functions that you need to implement when you subclass it or overwrite when you subclass it. We have the constructor, where you will declare like the layers, so that will be the architecture of your neural network. And then you have the forward method, which is essentially passing the data to the neural network and then making sure that it does all the matrix multiplications and activation function on the data through all the layers. So that's what the forward pass does, and that's what the constructor is. So when you want to subclass the model, you first call super to call the parent class, and then in the same way we had the nn.sequential here, where we are stringing up a bunch of convolutions and activation functions and some Boolean layers. And convolutions is just basically some ways to multiply and add numbers. And the max call 2D is just taking a max number over some box. And we'll go into the theory behind CNNs on tomorrow. And the forward pass just essentially is propagating the input through the neural network. So you can pass the input to the features, which was that torch.nn.sequential. And it's good to note that the sequential is quite convenient function, because if you didn't have the sequential, then you would have to apply the first linear layer to the input and then get that output out, and then apply the second linear layer. So this just the nn.sequential just makes it very easy just to pass the input through the sequential model and get out the output. And here we just flattening the output of the convolutions and activation functions, and then we have a classifier. So we'll go into it tomorrow, but this is essentially learning some features, like some edges, and then afterwards we're using a classifier to essentially bundle up the different edges to figure out what picture it is. And we only need to implement these two methods, and back propagation, which is essentially just calculating the loss and then calculating the gradient and then updating the parameters. So the update rule, that's handled by PyTorch, so you don't need to do anything. And it's important to note that there's two ways that you can do propagation through the network. One is to initialize the neural network that you have, and then once you've initialized the neural network, just passing the data to the model. And one way, which is not good, is to directly call the forward method on the images. So this can sometimes work, but you shouldn't do it, because the passing the input data directly to the neural network object essentially is calling the __ call method, and the __ call method calls other functions as well, not just the forward method. So it calls other functions to but yeah, we can go into that later. But just important that you call it directly in the model. So the key takeaways is that the data set allows you to organize access to your data set by individual samples, and wrapping the data set into a data loader allows you to have the logic for batching, shuffling, and reading multiple data at once without you having to implement the logic. And the module class allows you to have reusable building blocks for a neural network, and you need to override the init method and the forward method, and passing the input data directly to the model is the idiomatic way to do the forward pass. And we can use nn.sequential to have like a cleaner way to have chains of layers of the neural networks. Cool. So we have like a short quiz. We'll paste it into the Slack
Do you have the code?
Yes, I do. Well, one moment.
Can I just get a quick show of hands? Who's actually attempted to install the code locally? Who's experiencing problems with that? No, you've all installed it perfectly.
It's really come a long way, isn't it?
Yeah. I've got to say, we've done something, you're so experts. Okay, that's good. Who's going down the PLF route then? Yeah, it's fine. Good.
All right, so I pasted the code in the ICCS Summer School Slack. So you can navigate to that website, and there's some questions that you can look at. Yeah, so that's what you should see. Yeah. Great. Anybody have any trouble with opening that link? No.
Or make it bigger?
Right. Right, so I think, Isaac, shall we proceed with the quiz?
Yeah.
In the interest of time, we'll probably go through this, but we've got a few questions. What is the primary purpose of an activation function in neural networks? Have people responded to that yet?
Yes, so you got make sure of answers. That's mostly correct. So the purpose of an activation function is to introduce nonlinearity into the data. So it enables you to learn nonlinear relationships in the data. So what are the methods which need to be implemented in the dataset class? So there's 3 methods. So you can just type some answers. So go for it now. So the first one is the constructor, so the init method. The second one is the length method, so learning, so the PyTorch knows how big a data that is. And the last one is the get item method. So getting a single item from the data set. What?
You did.
You can say what does the data loader class do, so you can just give one thing that the data loader does.
You go.
Yeah, we've got a good range of answers. So one is for loading the data, wrapping. So wrapping it wraps around the dataset class, so it handles shuffling the data and batching the data. You know, getting more than one data at a time. Yeah, that's cool.
Submit.
Yeah. So when subclassing the nn.module, what is the forward method used for?
Answers now. We need to go to the exercise.
Yeah. So the forward method is used for running the forward pass in the neural network. So propagating the input throughout the throughout the neural network. That's the end. And we'll go on to some exercises, and that will lead the exercises.
Okay, right. So we don't have much time left in this session, so if you can all science. Right, so this is the GitHub repository that I've introduced already. Today we're going to try to get through this first exercise, classifying penguin species using tabular data. The task isn't very difficult. The key takeaway is to try to learn how to write idiomatic PyTorch. So I'm going to go along, run through this in VS Code. So hopefully you all have this. The first thing you should do is try to enable the relevant virtual environment. It'll probably be differently named to what I've got here. But yeah, the first task is we have this quite fun data set. It's a tabular data set with species of penguins and physical features of penguins and other features which might be relevant. I'm going to credit Jack in the room. He found this data set, so it's quite a fun thing to play around with. I hope you all have a good time messing around with this data set. The first task is to just look at the data. So first you need to import the data set. It will come out as a pandas data frame, and just take a bit of time just to see what's in the data set. It's a case of running this cell here. You get the data set equals load penguins. Right. So as I was saying before, we have physical features along with the species of the penguin, and we have about 344 examples altogether. This image kind of tells us a bit about what these physical features correspond to if you're not familiar with the anatomy of a penguin. But one interesting thing maybe you've observed is that we're getting some noun values here. So we probably don't want to train on these. We want to remove these from our data set. So there's also some useful things you can do in pandas data frames. You can call describe function, which gives you some statistical information about the features that you have. So means, standard deviations, min, max, ranges of the values. There's also the dataset.keys, which gives us all the features that we're going to be, well, the features that we have available to us, but not necessarily the features that we're going to use. Okay, so I'll move on to part B. The only important thing to do here is, well, just to run this cell and see what the data set is. The next task is just to uncomment this Seaborn library, which I've already got an error. I think there's an error in the code. Run the cell and look at the output. Okay, so this gives us quite a useful visualization of our data set. Maybe if people can run this on their machines or on the Colab and just identify what might be of interest in the data set. What is this telling us? So on the diagonal, we have the distribution of the features down here. So we see the bill length, the bill depth, the flipper length, and the body mass, and we see the distribution on a species basis. And in the off diagonals, the non-diagonals, we have distribution of the features and how they correlate to each other. This is telling us some quite useful information, that there are some classes that aren't that informative in terms of, sorry, there are some features that aren't that informative in terms of separating our data set. So these two species, Adelie and chinstrap of our penguins, are overlapping in this flipper length and bill depth sort of correlation distribution. So they're not really capable of separating our model using separating our classes using those single features, those two features. Let's just move on to the next task. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail. I'm kind of conscious of time. So there's also, all I'm trying to convey is that the very key things that you should be doing before creating a model. You should interrogate your data set and understand what features are telling you and visualize it as much as possible. If you just throw your data at a model, you can have some success, but more often than not, you're going to come unstuck. There's ways to, if you're dealing with very high dimensional data sets, there's ways to dimensionality reduce those. There are various techniques. UMAP is one of them, but a PCA is another, TSNE is another. But this gives you kind of some 2D representation of your data set, and you can see that it kind of allows you to pinpoint the relationships between all of the features, and by plotting this, you can see that you get these kind of clusters, these clusters that correspond to the species that we're trying to classify. So, interestingly, the Gen 2 species of penguin is right over here, so that seems quite easy to separate from our data set, whereas there's some overlapping examples on the right hand side. So the chinstrap and the Adelie are kind of the few examples here where we're just there's some kind of overlapping sort of feature information about these two classes. They could be mislabeled. They could just share a lot of the same properties. Okay, so given all of that visualization, can anyone tell me of the available features in our data set, what would be useful to our model to classify them? Does anyone know? Is anyone listening? So we've got species. Well, species is what we want to classify. Is what we want to find. We've got the island, bill length, bill depth, flipper length, body mass, sex, and the year. So what of those features, what can we use to classify our penguin species?
Bill length.
Yeah.
Length, body mass.
So why those features? Yeah, that's true.
Sex doesn't matter if you want to classify a species.
Why do you think sex doesn't really matter?
If we don't want to differentiate the sex of the penguin, so why should you?
Do you think the features might vary depending on the sex of the penguin?
I don't know.
So I would be inclined to include this. It's definitely going to be discriminative. So that is, yeah, something that I think would be worth including. You can see how the model performs with or without that. For the time being, I think I'm just going to use a few features. Let's just say I'm just going to choose a few features like build length and build depth. And now and see how it does. We don't need to copy these here, but if you really want to, you can. Okay, so Isaac has introduced this idea of using a dataset class to organize our data. This is probably going over old ground, but why do you think using a dataset class is useful? What do you think? What does it actually give us? What does using a class at all help us with? What are the advantages of that? Does anyone know? Yeah. I'll go.
So like consistency.
Yeah.
And usability.
Yeah, exactly. There are a few things that class gives you. There's this concept of modularity that you've probably heard of so far this week, but it's just this idea of separation of concerns. This is a key thing in software engineering. You have a class which organizes the processing of the data. This can be easily maintained and tested. Abstraction is another thing. So users of this class don't need to know anything about how it's implemented under the hood. They can just pull the data in and it will be suitable for use in the model. And finally, I've already covered it, but maintainability. It allows us to easily test, to extend in future. So it gives you a lot of things. As Isaac said, when you implement a PyTorch dataset, you need to implement the length and the get item. I'm just going to go over with you now what the dataset actually looks like that we're using in this exercise. But for the penguins example, we're subclassing the dataset class. And to initialize it, to construct it, we have to pass in the input keys, target key, and a train boolean. The input keys correspond to the features that we're going to use to train our model. The target key refers to the species in this case. So in the constructor, we load the penguin's data. We sort it. We set the indexes as standard pandas operations. We then split it into validation and training data frames, and produce this kind of label mapping. We also then implement the length function and the get item function. I'm conscious of time, but so the first thing to do is to just iterate over this data set. So I'm going to provide the species as our target key, and we want to pass features into our data set. So I'm just going to, this is horrible software engineering, but I'm going to, well, as it was, I'm going to improve things by creating this features variable and then passing the features into that. So hopefully this first step is fairly straightforward, but it's a case of printing your features and target. It's as simple as it kind of gets. And then I make a mistake. Oh yeah, I haven't actually executed the data. Right. So what you get is these list of your feature values along with the species that it corresponds to. It's pretty simple so far. can we use this? What do you think? Can we use this in a neural network or not?
No.
Thank you for playing along.
To normalise those features so they have values that are around 1 or 0.
Yeah. Normalizing is one thing we definitely need to be concerned about. Is there anything even more simpler than that? Yeah, strings, can't pass strings into a neural network. And what else? Is something a bit more subtle than that? What am I printing out here? Based on, just have a look at the class. What are we actually returning?
What data?
Hmm?
What data type?
Yeah, what data type, sorry, are we actually returning?
Tuples.
Yeah, we're just returning tuples. We can't pass tuples to train a model. We need to convert these into PyTorch tensors. The tensor is the fundamental data type used in PyTorch. We need to provide some logic to convert our data into that. You can think of tensors as like a sort of NumPy with some sort of GPU capabilities. We have an ability to track gradients and have a whole host of functions that can be applied to that data type, like means, all of your activation functions. It's a very powerful data structure. Right, so I think everyone's got to that point. The first task, and now I realized that we're hitting the half past now. So maybe this afternoon we can start on this. But the first task is just to complete the get item function in this class. So I've left some code or some comments here. I need to implement this get item function to enable it to return tensors. So you can have a go at that maybe between now and this afternoon, and then we'll come back, discuss it, and go on to the next step. So at the moment, we're just dealing with a data set. There are 4 things that we need to do. We need to define a data set or data set, a model, an optimizer, and a loss function. So on the first step. So I think we'll just leave it at that. Come and talk to me if you need be confused by anything. But yeah, hopefully see you all this afternoon, and we'll continue from there. So thank you.